Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Nadell. I'm the Executive Director of ACEEE, and I will be moderating this session, which is on establishing a productive role for natural gas in decarbonization. I'm going to say a few opening remarks, and then I'll introduce our panelists. They'll say their opening remarks, and we'll have plenty of time for a discussion. So as I noted, the session is on establishing a productive role for natural gas in decarbonization. Next slide. Presently, end-use natural gas, meaning residential, commercial, industrial, but not power sector, accounts for about 23% of U.S. carbon emissions. According to the Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook, that will rise a little bit to 26% under current policies. Their analysis doesn't assume any new policies are enacted. So not quite a quarter of U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. Now, there are a variety of ways that we can help decarbonize use of gas and of other fossil fuels. One, we can weatherize our homes, our buildings, reduce their energy use. Two, we can use decarbonized fuels, whether it's biogas, courtesy of our friend the cow in the upper right, hydrogen, or various other decarbonized fuels. And then once we've done those, if we can use whatever fuel you're using as efficiently as possible, we should do so, such as emerging natural gas heat pumps. And some of us heard a presentation about those in the previous session. Next slide. Now, one question as we think about ultimately decarbonizing fuels, and this is a long-term effort, we're not going to do it next year, is how much fuels are available. This is a chart from American Gas Foundation study a couple of years ago about renewable natural gas availability. They looked at various different subsets of biomass, green hydrogen, etc. And you can see the low case on the top and the high case on the bottom. Now, towards the top, there's this kind of dotted line. That's total residential use. So what they are saying is in the low case, not quite half of residential gas use can be provided. In the high case, most of residential use can be provided. But that doesn't deal with the fact that the residential sector only covers about 15% of present day natural gas use. Bottom line, yes, there is some decarbonized fuels, but it's not enough to meet all of our present natural gas needs, not unless we really heavily emphasize green hydrogen. So we're going to have to figure out what uses are most important for that and use efficiency and other sources for the rest. Next slide. Now, one of the questions that comes up is what are the economics of these alternative fuels? On the left, we have some estimates from the firm KPMG. You have what's called gray hydrogen, which is presently being used, usually natural gas through hydrogen reformation. It does emit carbon, and you could see the range of costs there. You then have blue hydrogen, which uses natural gas, but then captures the carbon and tries to store it. A bit higher. Green hydrogen, meaning like wind or solar using electrolysis, higher still, although they are projecting that that will come down quite a bit by 2050. Even still, it's going to be more expensive than present fuels, which is going to change the economics a bit for energy efficiency and for anything that uses a fuel. I'd also note that natural gas pipelines, hydrogen pipelines are starting to be built. The upper right shows some existing industrial hydrogen pipelines in Louisiana and Texas. And you can see a dotted line there where they're now starting to build a connection between these two so that you could ultimately transmit hydrogen across a good chunk of the Southeast. That said, this is really for industrial plants. It will not be for individual homes. Now, one thing to be aware of is hydrogen can be very corrosive. It can embrittle pipes. You can see a picture of that on the lower right. So we're going to have to be careful how much hydrogen we put in existing pipes. You can build specially designed pipes for new hydrogen. You can convert the hydrogen into synthetic natural gas, run it through present pipes, but it's not just throw the hydrogen to existing pipes. You can do some of that, maybe 15%, but not more. There's a little bit of background, if you will, as we get into our discussion about fuel decarbonization. And I think I have one last slide. Yes. Now I've been talking about some of the challenges of how do you decarbonize fuels, but let's remember also that electrification is not the answer for everything. There are hard to electrify uses. We're going to need fuels, whether it's high temperature heat in industry, whether it's long distance trucks, planes, and ships. It's fine to go a few hundred miles, but try going 1,000 miles on electrics, an awful lot of batteries. Backup heat for homes and buildings on very cold days. And we heard earlier presentation about some of the challenges with heat pumps in Minnesota. They're doing a lot, but they're finding that weatherization is vitally important, and you probably need a little bit of backup fuel. This particular chart comes from a training program by the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and you could see that first line, which shows that your conventional heat pumps really only go down to maybe 30 degrees, which means an awful lot of space heating, except that would need to be provided with either fuels or electric resistance. As you move to the middle line, the induction-based heat pumps, you can do quite a bit colder, call it 17, and then cold climate heat pumps can get down quite a bit more. So, but even still, there's generally going to be some backup that's either going to have to be electric resistance or fuels. So fuel decarbonization is going to be important. We can't just electrify everything. With that, that wraps up my intro slides. Let me introduce all three panelists, and then I'll have the first panelist talk. Our first panelist is Senator Chris Hansen, who represents Senate District 31 in Colorado, which is part of most of his districts in Denver. He specializes in energy economics and data analytics. He has over 20 years experience in the global energy efficiency industry, including time with IHS Markit, as well as at Oxford University. Our second speaker is Erica Larson. She's an attorney at Centerpoint Energy, where she has been involved in the development of proposals related to low and no carbon resources in Minnesota, such as a new law that the governor just signed that she's going to talk about. And our third speaker, Mike Henshin, is a principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute, where he works to decarbonize U.S. buildings through electrification of heating and other end uses. With that, let me turn it over to Chris.
All right, Steve, thanks so much. Great to be with everybody today, and excited to share a little bit about what's going on in Colorado on this subject, and then to learn from my colleagues about some of the other Minnesota and national trends. So lots of new momentum in this area of policy, of how to bring the natural gas sector, particularly the LDCs or the distribution companies, into the drive to decarbonize our economy across the board. Colorado has set some very specific economy-wide goals, and the bill that I'm going to share with you today is really about how to make those goals turn into action within the subsector of the natural gas LDCs. So with that, let's see if I can advance the slides here. All right, I figured this is a nice picture to start with. This is actually near my hometown out in the Eastern Plains, where we've got the old and the new, and there's a lot changing, of course, across the energy sector. And that is certainly the case now with the natural gas sector in Colorado. So let me talk about Senate Bill 264. It's the Clean Heat Bill, as it became known. A lot of detail here, and I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights, but essentially we set some targets, 4% reduction by 2025, 22% reduction over the 2015 baseline by 2030. We've let the PUC do the math. Always dangerous to have the legislative body do any math. We always mess it up. So we kick that over to the PUC, and they're going to help set the targets for the large and the small distribution companies. The PUC will be doing the implementation and have to accomplish these plans below a 2.5% rate impact cap. So this is one of the ways that we worked with the consumer groups to make sure that the costs were manageable by consumers. We also increased simultaneously the amount of heating assistance for low-income customers. So we really tried to make sure we weren't hurting low-income communities across the state. The PUC will prioritize investments in disproportionately impacted communities. So there's kind of an environmental justice aspect to the bill, as well as bringing in modeling on social cost of carbon and methane as we look at the cost-benefit analysis for different clean heat plan options. Obviously, we needed to take into account labor force issues, which we did in the bill, and really make sure that we're bringing this in line for low-income qualified programs that sit in the other parts of the sector. So what does this mean for natural gas utilities? Well, this is kind of a nice picture to make sense out of it. By 2025, we've got to reduce by 4%. 1% of that can come from recovered methane. So there's kind of a subcategory or a sub-target. And that results in about 3.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent reduction. And then by 2030, a 22% reduction, with approximately a quarter of that coming from methane recovery, for a total of 15 million metric tons reduction. I think the important thing here is that the plans that are put forward by the utilities can integrate gas utility DSM. So we heard about that from Steve, as well as beneficial electrification programs. They all can contribute to that green part of the graph. Recovered methane from coal beds, agriculture resources, dairies in particular in Colorado hold a lot of promise, as I'm sure they do in Minnesota, for renewable gas possibilities, wastewater treatment plants, landfills, all eligible, as well as hydrogen projects. And so we've really tried to create a framework that has clear goals to be met, but a huge amount of flexibility for the LDCs to figure out how to get there, use DSM and efficiency, use beneficial electrification as part of those plans, as well as some of the other options on the table for renewable fuels and hydrogen. So a great, I think, wide remit for us to figure out how to get there. I think the utilities are feeling pretty confident about 2025, but still a lot of work to do, and new technologies need to be proved out for us, I think, to hit the 2030 goal. But we've created, I think, the right set of incentives and the right targets that we think are doable in the state of Colorado. So some great progress on this, and just wanted to provide kind of an overview of Senate Bill 264 to everyone that is now being implemented by the PUC. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Erica to talk about what happened in Minnesota.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to try and talk very quickly about the Natural Gas Innovation Act in Minnesota. CenterPoint Energy was one of the primary champions of this. Obviously, no bill happens with just one stakeholder wanting it. There's a large coalition that wanted this bill to happen, but CenterPoint Energy was very involved and very happy that we saw it through. See if I can advance. Go through this really quickly. We're a big utility company is sort of the summary of this slide. In Minnesota, we are the largest gas utility in the state by a pretty large margin. Our biggest city is Minneapolis. We don't have any electric in Minnesota. We have corporate carbon goals. So we have a net zero goal for our own operations. That really has to do more with where we are in electric utility. So in Indiana, primarily where we have generation. I am more focused on the 20 to 30% emissions reduction goal on the right hand of this little graphic. That is focused on our customers and their end uses and trying to help them reduce their emissions, primarily from natural gas use that we provide to them. So the Natural Gas Innovation Act allows utilities essentially to start playing with some of these resources that will allow us to decarbonize. And the bill lists out a set of resources that utilities can start working with. You can see them up here on the slide. There are both fuel resources, so things like renewable natural gas, biogas, hydrogen, ammonia, and also non-fuel resources, energy efficiency, strategic electrification, carbon capture, and district energy. A quick overview of how an innovation plan is, how this whole structure is supposed to work. So it's optional for a gas utility to file an innovation plan, but once they're in, they're in. So you get the option to file a plan or not, but then once you've filed one, you have to file another one after 4 years. So they run for 5 years, and so you're gonna have to start another one before your first one finishes. There are going to be annual status reports for the Public Utilities Commission can order modifications to the plan, And there's a cost cap, like in the Colorado bill. Our cost cap increases over time. There's also a sort of little bonus amount that's available for certain kinds of RNG projects that the legislature particularly liked, things that use sustainable prairie grasses, wastewater treatment, and programs that support organics recycling programs. So the heart of the bill is really the content of the innovation plan. And there's a lot of content. There's more than I was going to put on the slide and make you suffer through. But the heart of the bill is about reducing emissions, carbon emissions from natural gas. But there's also a lot of other benefits the legislature wanted to see, economic benefits, benefits for our agricultural sector, benefits for our low and moderate income customers. The innovation plan also has to do a lot of comparison. So the goal here is to find the most beneficial, lowest cost ways to achieve these greenhouse gas reductions, which means that we need to do a lot of comparison of the different innovative resources against each other. So the bill requires that, if a utility puts up a residential RNG program, they also have to talk about why they didn't put up a residential energy efficiency program or a residential electrification program, why they think RNG is the best way to tackle those emissions. In addition, the utility has to put up some sort of skeleton plans. So there's going to be a proposed plan that has a certain amount of greenhouse gas reductions. The utility is also going to have to sort of play out what it would be like if they proposed a plan that had half the greenhouse gas reductions or double the greenhouse gas reductions. What does the cost look like for those different sizes? The goal there being to figure out whether the utility is struck for the right size of plan. Before we can start the real work of doing these innovation plans, the commission has to work through some of this introductory stuff, which is what we're working on right now in Minnesota. So there's a docket that's establishing carbon accounting frameworks and cost benefit frameworks for innovation plans that the stakeholders are all very busy with. The bill also opened a gas futures docket to consider the role of natural gas utilities in a sort of a broad way in a decarbonized system. The commission has opened that docket, although there hasn't been a lot of action in it yet. And then the last thing I wanted to say, and I think probably many of you know this, is, and I said it at the beginning, is that nothing like this happens without a broad coalition. And we had a very broad coalition in Minnesota. Minnesota is the only state in the country right now that has a divided legislature, with one house being held by Republicans and the other being held by Democrats. So nothing happens unless everybody agrees on it, essentially. So we had unions, agricultural groups, environmental organizations, utilities, RNG advocates, all uniting behind this bill. And I'm very proud of the stakeholder collaboration we were able to bring together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Mike, I'm sorry, but we can't hear you.
All right. How about now?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everybody for your patience there. And let me get the slides back up. Great. So policy and the regulatory action is picking up, and I'm going to highlight a few examples around the country where this is happening. So we just heard about Colorado and Minnesota. I would say in both those cases, we see a flexible framework driven by legislation that it just creates a process where the utilities are then going to bring forward plans, and it creates a process for the regulators to review and approve or change those plans. But elsewhere around the country, we see a few different models. And one example I'll point to is Massachusetts, where the regulator has opened a docket, this Future of Gas proceeding, like Erica talked about in Minnesota, and really starts with asking a lot of broad questions about the future of revenues that the gas utility can collect from customers, the future of investments and long-term gas planning, impacts on rates and service to customers. And one approach we've seen in Massachusetts is really the regulator setting the agenda, but then asking the utilities to come back with the plan, with the first proposal. And this is controversial to some extent, and I'll show a headline from the Boston Globe that illustrates that. And so we're here talking about a productive role for natural gas utilities, and we also, on the flip side, have this critique or question from folks challenging the role of the utilities. So we have a bit of this dynamic, which I will get into later, where some are questioning why the utilities are at the center of this. But elsewhere, that's been a similar approach. So Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. are both examples where the gas utility has produced or been heavily involved in producing a long-term plan. Philadelphia Gas Works is the largest municipally owned gas utility in the country, in a city where the mayor has committed to carbon neutrality. And the city has taken on this study to assess how does that organization diversify its business in the future. Or in Washington, D.C., the utilities, both electric and gas, have been required to put forward their climate plans and are continuing to iterate those with their regulators. In places like Nevada, we see other processes just getting underway, asking these really broad questions about understanding the future use of gas, the emissions associated with them, what the alternatives are, the impacts of decarbonizing gas on the electricity system and how the two systems interact with each other, and cost planning, mitigation measures. So many places are at this stage of just asking the right questions and starting in on these processes. New York was one of the first ones to move. We expect to see new guidance from the Commission soon on the long-term planning, but we have seen utility-specific requirements already come out. So we have utilities like Con Edison in New York City already pursuing non-pipes solutions, where they're identifying specific segments of infrastructure that under normal processes would be planned for replacement because they're leak prone, they're a certain older material which needs to be replaced. And instead of replacing them, looking for opportunities to transition the customers served by that infrastructure off of gas altogether so that they're able to decommission an asset instead of replace it. And they're experimenting with this approach to see what the possibilities can be. So just to come back to the concepts, when Steve opened on his slide, it said, establishing a productive role for natural gas in decarbonization. And in different places on the website, I've seen two versions of that title. And the other one said establishing a productive role for natural gas utilities. So the word utilities is key. We see natural gas is a commodity, it's a thing, it gets burned, it creates carbon emissions. The gas utilities are organizations with expertise and people who are critical to this transition. And just to surface some of the differing views on this, I wanted to highlight a couple points as far as the role of gas utility in this transition. So starting up on the left, net zero commitments. We've seen quite a few gas utilities come out and make new commitments to decarbonize their systems. And I would say those commitments in general are expanding to more utilities and are getting better and are recognizing the role of a broader set of resources. The utilities also offer customer efficiency programs, and those programs are going to be critical on any path to meet these goals. People in these utilities have knowledge of their systems, they have expertise, which will be crucial, whatever the future of the gas system is. And we recognize the need for safe, reliable service on the gas system as long as a customer is using it. On the flip side, there are real concerns that a gas utility as an investor-owned entity has a profit motive to continue building infrastructure and earning on that. And that may create a conflict of interest that steers towards certain solutions and away from others. Or that utilities have a reputation for being conservative or slow to change, and that we've seen examples of organizing among utilities against electrification as a solution. So look forward to diving into all this and hand it back to Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll have all of our panelists. First, I'm going to ask whether any of the panelists have comments or questions for the other panelists. Does anybody have something they want to raise before we move into some other questions?
I'll throw one out for Erica if I could, just about the cost cap negotiation in Minnesota. And if you might just give us some background on kind of the major stakeholders there and how you settled on the escalating cap.
Yeah, so we started with a higher cap, slightly higher. I think we had 5% or 4.5%. We knew we were going to be talked down. And then I think the major stakeholder who really weighed in on the cap and how it should operate was our Department of Commerce, which is sort of a ratepayer advocate in Minnesota. And we had very extensive negotiations with them about how it would work. We, I think, share a goal with them to see this grow, to see decarbonization happen. You know, they are in part responsible for achieving these economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions goals that our state has, and nothing has happened on the gas side so far. So I think they were willing to let it grow over time, but they wanted to reduce the initial shock. Can I throw a question back at you? I'm curious about how you set the target for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. That was one thing we had struggled with in Minnesota because we just have so little experience to know what is even achievable.
Yeah, well, and as I think I shared in my remarks, I think we had a lot of confidence in the first target of 2025. I think there's kind of less consensus the 2030 target and the final level there of 22%. But I think that was really a back and forth between, you know, folks wanting to push the envelope and the utilities wanting to make sure they didn't get overextended, and that was 22 is kind of where we settled in. I think the part of the framework was from the governor's office, energy office, and a roadmap that they completed in 2020, which did some sector by sector responsibility assignment, and they assigned 20 to 25% contribution from the natural gas sector, and so that was a bit of an anchor for that negotiation. And then we really started just doing some bottom-up analysis of what we thought the resource could look like. So I know Steve shared the graph from the Gas Foundation and the American Gas Association, where they did an estimate. And so we looked at several research documents, including that one, to try to do a bottom-up analysis of total available resource. And that was kind of a number that was a midpoint of comfort, I guess, for the final version of the bill.
Okay, great. Any other questions or comments? Not hearing any. I'm going to ask a couple of questions in a second, but I wanted to encourage the audience to start using the chat and add your questions, because after I ask a few questions, I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. So let's start getting those out there. Okay, each of you mentioned in passing the role of energy efficiency, and obviously you're all feeling your way along. Do you have a sense how big a role energy efficiency may play in your efforts to meet the caps over the next decade, as well as longer term, as part of efforts to ultimately decarbonize the sector?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that one. I mean, I think energy efficiency is going to be a big part of that 22%. I think depending on which utility you talk to, they have different levels of emphasis on it. As you can imagine, the utilities that were gas and electric view this situation different from the utilities that are gas only. And so that sort of the beneficial electrification piece of it sitting side by side. And so for gas and electric utilities, there's not a net loss there in revenue if there's some electrification. So they're going to look at it a little bit differently. But I would say, efficiency, I would guess, is going to be about a quarter of that 22% that gets us to that target by the end of the decade. That's my rough guess, just kind of across all the utilities. Some will do more, some will do less. Of course, if you in Colorado, we've got drastically different climate between the plains and the high mountains. And so the impact of efficiency measures, are going to change a little bit by climate zone. But I would guess that it's about a quarter of that goal.
Yeah, go ahead. You haven't talked yet, Mike, so go.
Well, I'll just chime in that when we look at, the folks who do analysis of the, these decarbonization scenario analyses, state by state or for the whole country, really to decarbonize the residential and commercial building sector, regardless of which fuel pathway is depicted in a scenario, everybody almost always has to assume pretty substantial increases in the weatherization of buildings in order to reach a carbon-free or net zero carbon future. So it's kind of it shows up as a universal element, I would say, in all the credible plans. And that's the importance of that escalates the farther north in the country you go and the colder the winters you get.
Yeah, I mean, I echo everyone that energy efficiency is absolutely foundational. If we don't do energy efficiency, we're not going to make it. Like that's a minimum. And then we sort of add, I think, all these other things on top of what we've accomplished with energy efficiency to get us to where we need to be. I'm going to hit, I saw Marty's question come up and I think it's related. So I'll hit on that too, if that's, so in the natural gas industry, so CenterPoint and the other utilities in Minnesota have longstanding energy efficiency programs through our conservation improvement program. The way the conservation improvement program works is it compares energy efficiency basically to the cost of fossil gas. There's a little bit of an adder for environmental benefit, but it's basically is it cheaper to do this with gas or with efficiency? NGIA has a different structure, right, where you are comparing different options for decarbonization against each other rather than against the price of fossil gas. The question is whether RNG is better than efficiency or electrification, which one of these is the most cost-effective way to get at these emissions. So we have in the bill, in the act now, that energy efficiency can't be an NGIA unless the Commissioner of Commerce determines that it can't be an investment could not reasonably be included in a utilities conservation improvement program. And there's debate right now about exactly what that means. What I hope it means is that, there are certain things that are not going to be, maybe you could shove them into a conservation improvement program somehow. You could fit them in there, even though they're not really very cost effective. They don't really help the utilities' financial incentive at all. But I hope that they will find that's not really reasonable to include in a conservation improvement program. So you could put those in NGIA. And what that would do is it would really open up the door to maybe having very, very large rebates for measures that we want to accomplish. Have a little bit of a conservation improvement program rebate and then a big NGIA rebate, because that's how you're going to get the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And it's cheaper than doing RNG or some other option. That makes the accounting very complicated. How much savings do you attribute to each program? How much incentive is the utility eligible for if you have both programs operating on the same measure? So that's going to be hard, but I really hope we get there as a state, because I think that either NGIA is not going to have much of a role at all in energy efficiency, or it's going to have a really dramatic role. And I'm hoping for the second one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, in Colorado and Minnesota, the focus is somewhat on the, call it next 8-ish years or so. Question is, what is your thinking about longer term, and what are the path or pathways to full decarbonization, say by 2050? Do you have any thoughts on that? These are probably more personal, because obviously the laws don't go there at this point.
Well, Steve, we actually set up a framework for the clean heat plans to be submitted after 2030. So that process will continue at the PUC even after the 2030 target. My guess is there'll probably be some update legislation between now and then. Would just be a guess, but I think the long-term outlook is that we need to move to net zero economies, and that the natural gas sector is going to have to participate that in a even more fulsome way in the 2030s. And so I'm imagining, more offset and carbon offset mechanisms, tradable mechanisms, more opportunities to create and trade credits is going to have to be a big part of the 2030s, with the end goal of getting to net zero. And so that's my best guess of some of the follow-up legislation in Colorado.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll take it, Steve. I mean, I think as we think about the concept of net zero is the word we hear a lot. So the net meaning that we'll reduce emissions to some level and then offset or have negative emissions for the remainder. And really want to, emphasize the challenge of relying too heavily on the latter part of that equation of offsets and negative emissions to get us somewhere. Given a track record of mixed at best performance of traditional offsets and the high cost of carbon dioxide removal. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity for direct emissions reductions to zero rather than net zero for most of these end uses, especially in the residential and commercial building sector. And that we're going to see, we last year like 8 trillion cubic feet of gas were burned in that sector in this country, and that of natural gas that came out of the ground, and that number needs to go way down or be zero. And so fundamentally, that's the challenge. And we believe that efficiency and electrification are the first and foremost parts of that solution.
Okay. Great. Why don't I start mixing in some audience questions? I have a few more, but let's take advantage of the audience questions. And if other people in the audience have questions, please put them in the chat. Well, we have one question from Maureen McNamara. Anyone seeing a role for gas demand response, particularly in areas that use gas-fired electricity?
Well, I'll jump in real quick. I mean, the answer I think is yes, particularly after what happened in Texas in February. But I don't think it has a big impact on our topic today because it's really about trying to get through short-term shocks and stochastic events, whatever you want to call them, with demand side measures. But ultimately, what Mike said is the direction we have to go, which is we're burning less, we're using less over time. Obviously, demand side response, super to get through a crisis, but doesn't have a big effect on annual or decade-long decarbonization.
I was just going to say almost exactly the same thing. We're seeing it with our Winter Storm Uri conversation, and should we have demand response programs to respond to price? But yeah, I don't see it. I mean, you could maybe get some emissions reduction out of it, but I don't see it playing a huge role. Of course, I'm not on the electric side, so I would defer to others on that piece.
And I would note some of the Canadian utilities are doing a little. I know there's also some work happening in New York State. So there is some. Let's say, a question from Amy Belpasht, asking about what is the near-term productive role for natural gas as you deal with demand for new infrastructure or new customers? Should we be providing them with natural gas, or should we be thinking about some alternative?
Who wants that hot potato? Yeah, I mean, we've obviously seen two extremes in state legislatures already. One is doing what Berkeley does, and the other is making sure that nobody can do what Berkeley did. So that's the bookends are already set. A lot of conservative states have done ban the bans, and there's some more progressive states that are heading in the other direction. I guess what I would say from Colorado's standpoint is I don't think there is enough political support to go down, a local ban or that direction. There may be some cities in Colorado that may want to look at that. I think what we've done instead is really try to incorporate a full cost analysis into PUC planning. So social cost of methane, social cost of carbon, cost benefit of what our 60, 70, 80-year investments in new gas infrastructure is going to be heavily scrutinized based on need and the emissions that are going to be attributable to that resource. And I think that's a change in Colorado, because it in the past had been a fairly rubber stamp process of, hey, if you can demonstrate new demand, you get approval for new rate-based assets in the gas sector. And I think that dynamic is going to shift.
Yeah, Chris called it a hot potato because it's controversial, or it feels controversial. but it's also really important. I mean, we see lots of spending on the gas system, whether it's extending to new customers or these big programs of gas main replacement. I mean, there are cities in this country that are replacing all or nearly all of their gas system. The city of Chicago is in the midst of a 30, 40-year program to replace every gas line in the city with a new pipe. And I think it's reasonable to ask if that is a prudent investment from a societal point of view. And even if we consider that some new things are going to flow through the pipe, some other molecules are going to flow through that pipe, we know from even the most optimistic study that Chris shared earlier that those are volume constrained, and that if we're going to use a biomethane or something else, it's going to be in a small quantity, much smaller than the current quantities today. And so that's why we see this surge of all the states I highlighted in green, where regulators are starting to ask these questions of, are these prudent investments anymore? And that if it's falling short of like the ban, the Berkeley ban, we see other pathways. Even Chris, in the state of Colorado, that the regulator is proposing to change the practice of where someone building a new house gets the cost of the gas line covered or partially covered for them, and they have to pay their own way if they want to connect to the system. Or we see a new requirement for gas utilities, or at least a proposal for gas utilities to come to the regulator every couple of years with their investment plan and get approval in advance instead of just getting it rubber stamped, like Chris said. So I think the future, a financially prudent version of this does require trimming back those investments and starting now, because they have a long life.
I do think it's important just to push back a little bit on, methane is very important, and getting a handle on methane is extremely important. And the replacement of pipe is generally replacing very old mains with newer materials that are going to cut down on that methane leakage. So unless you have a very near-term plan for substantially cutting down gas usage, I think it's likely often still going to be prudent from an environmental perspective to just have tighter pipes. Most of CenterPoint Energy's investment now is doing pipe replacement, and we believe that we have had a very significant drop in our methane because we have gotten the cast iron pipe out of our system, and now we're getting rid of the bare steel, and we're going to move on to the legacy plastics. And I don't see, I'm all for doing these decarbonization things, but next 10, next 15, next 20 years, gas is going to be, there's still going to be a lot of gas in those pipes, and we need to control that methane leakage.
Okay. And I will just add, one reason I showed that picture of hydrogen pipes, it's not all or nothing. You either provide pipes to everybody or you provide pipes to nobody. That's one example of maybe large users will have some type of pipes, and where it's not going to be as economic for smaller users. And obviously there'll be lots of plans that will get into that far more detail. Now, Chris, you got into a little bit of issues about red and blue states. So I'm going to ask if people have opinions. Obviously, Minnesota and Colorado, I'd call them purple. Mike talked more about blue states, but some purple. Is there a way to get red states to start thinking about these issues? Anybody have some thoughts there?
Well, there are a few that are looking at RNG. Oklahoma has some proceedings going. They're not, I think, taking the decarbonization angle, but there are aspects of this I think you can get them interested in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think RNG opportunities for ag producers to create some new revenue streams. You'll see, the dairy states and the Oklahoma and the like. I think we'll probably move forward with some of those things. So, the gatherings of Republican legislators, there is plenty of model legislation on that front that is absolutely making the rounds. So I think that's a piece of it. You're likely to see several states pick that up next session and the session after.
Yeah,
Mike was it. Go ahead, Mike.
Ultimately, if we're going to decarbonize our economy, elected officials want to decarbonize our economy and pass policies that do that. But in the meantime, we do see things. I mean, one aspect is like adjacent issues like air quality. So, the state of Utah actually is a state with one of the few places where there are standards on the nitrogen oxide emissions from gas equipment. So requiring a lower standard of air pollution from that gas water heater, for instance. So that's something we could see, just based on ozone issues locally, expand to more places. Or it's also true that, the Southeast, if we talk about heat pumps and electrification as a solution, by far the most electrified part of this country is the southeastern United States, which has plenty of red state politics. And there's opportunities for, market supportive approach. There are electric utilities around there who would love, I'm sure, to sell their customers more heat pumps and sell them more electricity that way. So I think we see, it's a mix. There are some opportunities, but ultimately we need politicians to pass climate policies if we're actually going to decarbonize.
And to this list, I'd also add in some areas there is surplus renewable energy at certain hours. And that may provide another opportunity to provide value to that by generating hydrogen or whatever. So there's another possible route. Okay, we have a question from Adway B. Hope I'm not mispronouncing the name. In Minnesota, what estimated percentage of GHG emission reduction will Centerpoint be able to achieve with the use of NGIA plans? Do you have any sense of it yet, or is it still a work in progress?
No, we don't. And I know Adway, he's at our Department of Commerce. So good try, Adway. No, we'll be putting our innovation plan together, probably later this year and early next year. And then we're going to try and get a better sense of what's possible and what we should be filing for this first plan.
Okay, very good. So Adway, stay tuned. It's coming soon to an inbox near you, but not quite yet. Okay, again, encourage people to ask questions, but I'll throw another one out there. And we got a little into this. What do you see as the role of gas transmission and distribution networks in a decarbonized world? To what extent will they play a role? And is it going to be just for big users? Is it for everyone? You have a sense of that in Minnesota might be a good example where the North may be different from the South.
It may be. So we did, one of the things we did sort of with many of the stakeholders that supported NGIA was we did a process called G21, where we looked at the future of the gas utility sector, how we would decarbonize the gas sector. End use is currently served by natural gas. And my conclusion from that was that a very realistic, and in fact, our E3 found the cheapest option for Minnesota involved both electrification and renewable fuels, and using renewable fuels as backup, like you talked about early in your first presentation, for those coldest days of the year, those polar vortex days in residential homes. So if you do that, you keep a pretty big gas distribution system because you're still connected to many, many residential homes. I think, they also found that industry would still require, some sort of fuel, which I think that's true all over the country.
Anybody else have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, to the question earlier, the broader framing of this session about a role for the natural gas utilities, I think the gas system is complicated and people don't understand it very well, people outside of the gas utilities. And so certainly an important role for gas utilities is to help understand all the nuance of this. And so if there's an industrial customer and they're going to be served by hydrogen in the future, what does that mean? Do they get a dedicated hydrogen line? And if there's other customers served by the same line, is there some way for them to use that? Or if there's a branch that's purely residential and there's a need to replace that pipe, is there an opportunity for a non-pipe solution to make those customers more efficient and electrify instead? And there's any number of criteria how you would prioritize what solution you're going to use where. And with regulatory oversight, I would hope that that's a place where the gas utilities can be helping to map out the system and understand these different elements. But then there's one specific thing I would emphasize, which is we have the system today that we have, and we have the potential expansion of that system in the future. And I think the easiest piece to eliminate or to scale back is that potential expansion. And so even as we think about the E3 study in Minnesota, that scenario that Erica talked about includes all electric new construction for residential and commercial buildings and not extending the gas system beyond where it is today. And so that's why the new construction, even though it's been controversial, is the low-hanging fruit and is where a lot of the conversation is starting.
I'll just quickly chime in and add to that. I think it's that question is going to depend a lot on the marginal cost of production of green hydrogen and green ammonia. If those are fuels that are cost effective in the 2030s, that existing gas infrastructure could be very useful for those zero carbon fuels. So I think the long-term answer is heavily dependent on sort of the economics of green alternatives.
Okay. Now, one thing, as I thought about this, obviously a large customer, it's much easier to cost effectively serve with a pipeline. I was wondering if anybody's explored this at all for the more distributed customers, particularly in more rural areas. Do we think about something like compressed renewable natural gas that would just be stored there for use during polar vortex events? Has anybody thought about that, or is that a wild idea?
That's interesting. One thing we have thought about that's related is the idea of having biogas in some of these rural areas. So if you have a local biogas source and you have uses for it nearby, maybe you avoid the cost of upgrading to RNG quality. You avoid the cost of connecting all the way out to the utility system, which might be quite far away. And then you just have specialized equipment that's capable of handling the lower quality biogas. But I haven't thought about the delivery of compressed. You'd have the carbon issue of trucking, so you'd have to factor that in. But I mean, could be uses for it that would be good.
Okay. Let's see. We have time for a couple more questions. So people have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to ask one that came up at the last EER conference, which happened to be in Minnesota. And at the time, what is now a former CenterPoint employee had suggested maybe we as a gas utility should get into electrification and helping our customers electrify. Often it was going to be dual fuel. I wasn't saying, do anybody have opinions about that?
We're doing it. It's in the act. We are required to offer a electrification and very extreme weatherization program for residential customers with gas backup. So we're gonna try out this model of doing the gas backup and the electrified heat pump. So we're excited for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's great if we can build up more of that. And in fact, that's also envisioned in the Colorado policy and others. And certainly, it's easier for management to wrap their heads around at a combined gas and electric utility. But it's also something regulators and policymakers can think about that. If there is a vision, if a vision has a large amount of electrification, and the use of gas is going to decline dramatically, as we think it will, and it needs to, then how do you create what's the incentive structure for a gas utility? Because as long as you have one customer served by gas, they have to be served safely and reliably and affordably. So you need the system to function how you want it to, even if it's shrinking in size. And so those utilities, we can think about a new performance-based regulation or performance incentives around decarbonization for those gas utilities that might give them some opportunity to offer that to their customers.
We would love an incentive. We didn't think we would get away with asking for one because we were championing this bill, but I think next round when we have our actual targets and a more aggressive bill after we've given this one a little time, definitely we would take an incentive. We would like that.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Peggy Neville. How have these states justified to the PUCs having gas ratepayers pay for the cost of electrification?
Well, we're not asking them to in Colorado. I mean, there's certainly that is an option for a combined gas and electric utility to have that help them meet their targets. But I guess the beneficial electrification program is going to stand on its own 2 feet. That's why it's called beneficial electrification, not just electrification. And so I don't see a big danger of cross-subsidization there in Colorado.
In Minnesota, we've defined strategic electrification so that they remain a gas customer. So we really see it as just, it's just energy efficiency. It's sort of an extreme version of energy efficiency where you're really cutting down on that gas use. But then we have the same justification for it as we do for any other energy efficiency program.
Right. And in particular, this is part of effectively a least cost plan to meet your targets. The alternative might be higher cost.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, and there is some accounting emerging in Colorado and elsewhere around the cost of carbon being part of that equation. And so, there's at least some room in these frameworks for gas customers to pay for the cost of carbon. But at the end of the day, like this, Steve, you asked about what does this look like in 2050, which, is kind of an unknown, but we know it's got to be a dramatic change. And that one way or another, there's going to be a lot of money that needs to be spent to make that change happen. And I think a good broader question is like, how much of that money can we reasonably ask utility ratepayers to spend, whatever the transition is here? So, we see the federal government may spend money or other ways that taxpayers may spend money in the future, or something else that we're not thinking of. But we need to broaden our horizon a bit, that we might need frameworks that don't ask ratepayers to cover the entire cost of an energy transition.
Yeah. Now, I know, particularly in some of the European countries, there effectively is some, price on carbon, and that's one of the ways, same in Canada, how they finance some of this work, as opposed to just as the customers of a particular utility. Okay, why don't I see if anybody has any final closing remarks, given all this discussion? What would they like participants to take away? Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll just quickly say I hope we've got slightly different models in Colorado and Minnesota. It's the great laboratory of democracy that is the 50 states. We're going to try these out, hopefully make rapid progress and prove that these approaches can work. And, my hope is that a lot of other states with federal support, can move down these same paths. And this is a urgent experiment for us to get right.
Yeah, well, I'll add, I'm encouraged to see so many states and organizations taking this issue on, and even where there's uncertainty about the path forward, it's clear that action is preferable to inaction by far in a world where we're, failing to hit the climate targets that we've set out for ourselves. So hopeful for both what comes out of Minnesota and Colorado and elsewhere to show real progress in the right direction.
Yeah, those were both very good closing statements. I don't know if mine will be as good. This is a really exciting time, I think, to be at a gas utility. It's a challenging time, but it's very exciting. We have a lot of change in front of us, but I'm very encouraged by the work that has happened in Minnesota and by how well people have come together around ways that we can find to, we can all agree we should do energy efficiency, and we all agree that we should explore renewable fuels, and we all agree that we should explore strategic electrification. And I think that's a very good recipe for success for the state. And I hope that more states follow that model.
Okay, very good. And we look forward in 2023 when we are gathered in Philadelphia to hear a lot more about that. So please join me in thanking our panelists. I think it's been a great discussion. And with that, I guess our session is over. Thank you very much, everyone.